There's a specific pattern worth examining directly, one that connects genuinely deep capacity for feeling and connection with something that seems, on the surface, contradictory. Persistent difficulty maintaining more than a handful of close friendships, sometimes fewer than that. Today, we're going to trace the specific traits that consistently appear together in empaths who find themselves in exactly this situation, drawing together threads we've touched on throughout this series into a clearer, more complete picture. Let's start with the first trait because it often surprises people who assume friendlessness must indicate some kind of social deficiency rather than something considerably more specific. Trait 1: an unusually low tolerance for surface level interaction. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about the psychology of female empaths with zero friends. The heightened sensitivity to the gap between performance and authenticity that makes most casual, socially performed interaction genuinely uncomfortable to sustain. This trait shows up consistently across empaths with few close friendships, an almost physical discomfort with small talk, with the socially required but genuinely shallow exchanges that typically form the foundation from which most casual friendships gradually develop. Where most people can comfortably maintain years of pleasant, surface level acquaintance without this ever feeling like a problem, an empath with this specific trait often finds these same interactions genuinely draining, sometimes even distressing in ways that lead her to withdraw from exactly the ordinary social contact that would typically, gradually, deepen into something more. Trait 2: a pattern of becoming everyone's emotional support without ever developing reciprocal friendship. This connects directly to the one-directional caretaking pattern we've examined extensively throughout previous conversations. Empaths with few close friendships often, paradoxically, have many people who consider them a close friend, who rely on them consistently for support, without this reliance ever developing into the kind of mutual, reciprocal depth the empath herself actually experiences as genuine friendship. Over time, this imbalance produces quiet burnout and gradual withdrawal, leaving her with considerably fewer connections than her genuine warmth and generosity would otherwise predict. Trait 3: extremely high standards for emotional safety, developed through painful, accumulated experience. Remember what we discussed about narrowed trust following repeated betrayal. Empaths with few friendships often possess an unconsciously narrow threshold for who qualifies as worth investing in, a threshold calibrated through real experience of being exploited, dismissed, or treated as a resource rather than as a genuine equal. This isn't paranoia or excessive suspicion. It's protective calibration, though its practical effect often means very few people ever actually pass the accumulated tests required to earn genuine, sustained investment. Trait 4: absorbing group dynamics so intensely that larger social settings become genuinely exhausting rather than energizing. This connects to something we've traced throughout this entire series about empathic absorption of ambient emotional information. In group settings specifically, parties, larger gatherings, even casual group hangouts, this absorption compounds considerably because multiple people's emotional undercurrents are being processed simultaneously rather than the more manageable one-on-one dynamic. This often produces genuine avoidance of exactly the larger social contexts where casual friendships typically multiply and deepen through repeated group exposure. Trait 5: a tendency toward intense, meaningful one-on-one connection that most people find genuinely overwhelming to sustain. Here's something worth naming directly, because it reveals a specific irony worth understanding. The very depth an empath naturally brings to connection, the immediate desire for genuine substantive conversation rather than surface pleasantries, the intensity of presence she offers even in early acquaintance, can genuinely overwhelm potential friends who aren't accustomed to this level of depth arriving so quickly, before the more gradual trust-building process most people expect has had time to naturally unfold. Let's continue tracing the remaining traits, and then examine how these patterns compound together to produce something considerably more comprehensive than any single trait would explain on its own. Trait 6. Genuine difficulty tolerating relationships that require ongoing performance or maintenance of a specific persona. Remember what we traced throughout our conversation about the forbidden gift of the solitary empath. The way sustained time in genuine solitude strips away the capacity for comfortable self-deception, making it genuinely difficult to sustain the kind of ongoing social performance many friendships actually require in order to remain smooth and low conflict. Most friendships involve some degree of accepted, unexamined performance. Not lying exactly, but maintaining a slightly curated version of yourself, avoiding certain uncomfortable truths for the sake of social ease. An empath with this specific trait often finds this maintenance genuinely exhausting to sustain over time, which means friendships requiring this ongoing performance tend to feel increasingly effortful rather than naturally sustaining, eventually leading to quiet withdrawal. Trait 7. Hypervigilance toward being used or exploited, developed specifically because this pattern has genuinely occurred repeatedly. This connects to something we've traced extensively throughout this entire series about narcissistic strategy, specifically targeting empathic generosity. Many empaths with few friendships have experienced this exploitation repeatedly, not necessarily always through narcissistic relationships specifically, but through the more general pattern of people recognizing and taking advantage of her natural generosity across multiple relationships throughout her life. This accumulated experience often produces a specific protective hypervigilance that, while genuinely serving to protect against continued exploitation, also filters out considerable numbers of people who might have actually offered genuine reciprocal friendship simply because the accumulated caution makes extending initial trust feel genuinely risky rather than naturally easy. Trait 8. A genuine preference for depth over breadth that runs counter to how most social ecosystems actually function. Here's something worth understanding directly about a specific mismatch this trait creates. Most social environments, workplaces, extended friend groups, community organizations, are structured around a breadth-first model, where casual, moderate-depth connection with many people forms the norm, with genuine depth developing slowly, if at all, only with a small subset of those broader connections over considerable time. An empath with a genuine preference for depth over breadth often finds herself fundamentally out of step with this structure, uninterested in maintaining the broader network of moderate acquaintances most people rely on, which means she often lacks exactly the wide social foundation from which genuine close friendships eventually, statistically, tend to emerge for most people. Trait 9. Significant capacity for solitary self-sufficiency that reduces the practical urgency of building friendship networks. Remember what we traced throughout our conversation about the solitary empath's specific gift, the genuine clarity and genuine richness available through sustained time alone. This trait, while genuinely valuable in many respects, also removes some of the practical motivation that drives most people to actively pursue and maintain friendships out of genuine loneliness or genuine need for company. An empath with strong solitary self-sufficiency often experiences considerably less urgent discomfort with friendlessness than someone whose well-being depends more heavily on constant social contact, which paradoxically means she often doesn't pursue friendship building with the same active effort someone more uncomfortable with solitude might apply. Here's what's worth understanding about how all 9 of these traits, taken together, produce something considerably more comprehensive than any single trait would explain on its own. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how psychological patterns tend to compound rather than exist in isolation. Someone with even 3 or 4 of these traits already faces considerable friction in typical friendship building. Someone with most or all of them, as often genuinely occurs together in highly empathic people, faces something closer to systemic mismatch with how most social ecosystems actually function, producing exactly the pattern of persistent, genuine friendlessness this entire conversation has been examining. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why recognizing these traits together matters considerably more than simply cataloging them individually. This isn't a deficiency requiring correction, and it's not evidence of some fundamental social failure requiring urgent repair. It represents a genuine, coherent pattern, one that makes considerable sense once you understand how each individual trait connects to and reinforces the others, producing something considerably more comprehensive than random, unconnected social difficulty. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it, rather than leaving this conversation as simply a diagnostic catalog without addressing what genuinely matters most, what to actually do with this understanding, and how to hold it in a way that produces genuine connection rather than either resigned acceptance of permanent isolation or exhausting attempts to force yourself into patterns that were never actually going to work for you. The first thing worth understanding clearly is that these 9 traits, while genuinely producing friction with typical friendship building patterns, don't actually indicate that genuine, satisfying friendship is unavailable to you. They indicate something more specific and considerably more actionable, that the typical path most people follow toward building friendships likely isn't the right path for you, which means pursuing it more intensely, forcing yourself into more networking events, more casual social gatherings, more surface level interaction in hopes that eventually something deeper develops, likely produces exactly the exhaustion and eventual withdrawal we've traced throughout today's conversation, rather than the connection you're actually seeking. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that offers a genuinely different, more productive approach, specifically calibrated to these 9 traits, rather than fighting against them. Remember what we've traced throughout this entire series about the value of depth over breadth for this specific psychological type. Rather than pursuing wide friendship networks and hoping depth eventually emerges, consider deliberately seeking contexts specifically structured around depth from the beginning. Support groups organized around shared, meaningful experience, small, intimate gatherings rather than large parties, one-on-one activities that allow genuine conversation rather than group settings, where your absorption of ambient emotional information compounds exhaustingly. This isn't about avoiding people. It's about seeking connection through structures that actually match how you genuinely, naturally build relationship, rather than forcing yourself into structures built for a different psychological type entirely. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about trait 7 specifically, the hypervigilance developed through accumulated betrayal. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between healthy discernment and unhealthy, indiscriminate guardedness. If this specific trait has become broad enough that it filters out genuinely trustworthy people alongside genuinely exploitative ones, this deserves the same honest examination we discussed in our earlier conversation about over-applying protective frameworks in ways that damage healthy connection. Consider whether your current threshold for extending initial trust has become so narrow that it's costing you connection with people who would genuinely never exploit your generosity, simply because your accumulated caution can no longer distinguish accurately between them and the people who previously did. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses trait 2 specifically, the pattern of becoming everyone's emotional support without reciprocal development. Remember what we've traced throughout this entire series about the exhausting cost of one-directional caretaking. Consider deliberately and consciously practicing genuine reciprocity in existing relationships, actually allowing people to support you, actually sharing your own struggles rather than defaulting automatically into the caretaking role, actually testing whether the people currently in your orbit are capable of the mutual depth you're genuinely seeking, rather than assuming, based on the initial dynamic that's developed, that this is simply how all your relationships must inevitably function. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. These 9 traits don't describe a permanent, unchangeable condition requiring resignation to ongoing isolation. They describe a specific psychological pattern, one that, once genuinely understood, can actually be worked with rather than against. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how accurate understanding of any pattern represents the first essential step toward genuinely changing your relationship with it, rather than simply continuing to experience its effects without ever understanding their actual source. If you recognize yourself in several or all of these 9 traits, understand that the friendlessness you've experienced isn't evidence of some fundamental unlikability or fundamental social failure. It's the predictable, understandable result of possessing genuine depth of feeling and genuine capacity for connection. Deployed through methods most typical social environments simply weren't structured to accommodate. This doesn't mean genuine friendship remains permanently unavailable to you. It means the specific approach worth pursuing likely looks considerably different from what's worked easily for people without this particular combination of traits, requiring more deliberate, more intentional seeking of exactly the depth-first, reciprocal, genuinely safe connection your particular psychology actually needs in order to thrive, rather than continuing to force yourself into approaches built for a fundamentally different kind of social experience than the one you actually, genuinely have. Yahan Part 3, Me Additional Approximately 1,000 Words Hain, Part 3, Continued Expansion. The one you actually, genuinely have. There's one more dimension worth adding here because it addresses something practical many people wonder about once they've genuinely absorbed everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. Where, specifically, do you actually find people capable of matching this particular relational style if the typical social venues most people rely on genuinely don't work well for this psychological type? This question deserves concrete, honest examination rather than simply theoretical understanding of what to seek. Here's something worth understanding about specific contexts that tend to naturally filter for exactly the depth this particular psychological type is seeking, rather than requiring you to sift through wide networks of surface-level connection, hoping depth eventually emerges. Contexts organized around genuine shared vulnerability tend to work considerably better than contexts organized around casual social performance. This might include grief support groups, recovery communities, therapy-adjacent group settings, volunteer work involving genuine emotional investment rather than purely logistical tasks, or communities built around shared creative or spiritual practice that inherently require some degree of authentic self-disclosure simply to participate meaningfully. These environments share something crucial worth naming directly. They naturally select for people who are also comfortable with depth, who have also likely developed some version of the discernment and emotional sophistication this entire series has traced throughout so many previous conversations, which means the ordinary friction between your relational style and typical social expectations often diminishes considerably in exactly these contexts. Here's something worth understanding about a related, practical consideration: the pacing of friendship development itself, distinct from simply the venue where you meet potential friends. Remember what we traced about trait 5, the tendency toward intense, meaningful connection that most people find overwhelming to sustain when it arrives too quickly. Consider deliberately pacing your own natural intensity, not by suppressing your genuine depth, but by allowing it to unfold gradually enough that a new acquaintance has time to build corresponding comfort and corresponding trust, rather than experiencing your natural depth as sudden, unexpected intensity they weren't prepared for. This isn't about becoming less yourself. It's about recognizing that most people, even people genuinely capable of eventually matching your depth, needs somewhat more gradual pacing than your own natural instinct provides, and adjusting your timing, rather than your authenticity, to accommodate this genuine difference in pace. Here's something worth understanding about a specific danger worth naming directly, one that connects to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in many different forms. The risk of interpreting continued friendlessness as confirmation that something is fundamentally, permanently wrong with you, rather than as evidence that you simply haven't yet found the specific contexts and specific people genuinely capable of matching your particular relational style. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how psychological patterns, however genuinely challenging, don't represent permanent verdicts on your worth or your capacity for eventual, genuine connection. The 9 traits we've examined throughout today's conversation describe genuine friction with typical social patterns, not evidence that satisfying friendship remains permanently unavailable to someone with your particular combination of depth, sensitivity, and hard-won discernment. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, one that addresses something important about timeline and patience. Remember everything we've established throughout this entire series about genuine change requiring sustained effort over real time rather than arriving through a single decisive shift. Building genuine friendship according to the depth-first approach we've traced throughout today's discussion typically takes considerably longer than the more casual breadth-first approach most people rely on, precisely because it requires finding specific people capable of matching your particular relational style, rather than simply accumulating a wide network where a few deeper connections eventually, statistically, emerge on their own. This means patience, genuine and sustained, represents an essential component of this entire approach, worth understanding clearly rather than expecting quick results that match the more familiar, faster-moving pattern most people experience. 1 or 2 genuinely deep, genuinely reciprocal friendships, developed slowly and carefully over considerable time, likely represent a more realistic and ultimately more satisfying outcome than attempting to rapidly accumulate a wider network that never actually provides the depth you're genuinely seeking in the first place. This is ultimately the balanced understanding worth carrying forward from everything we've examined throughout this entire conversation. The 9 traits we've traced today explain genuine, real difficulty with typical friendship-building patterns, difficulty that deserves accurate understanding rather than either dismissal or excessive self-criticism. But understanding these traits accurately also reveals a genuinely different, more promising path forward, one that works with your particular psychology rather than against it, seeking depth-first contexts rather than forcing yourself into breadth-first environments that were never actually going to produce the genuine connection you're seeking, and allowing genuine patience for a process that unfolds more slowly but potentially arrives at something considerably more satisfying than the wider, shallower network most people settle for instead.